Istanbul rose from the sea like a stitched map of power. Domes and minarets, cedar and marble, gardens sloping toward the Bosphorus, where triremes and lateen sails knotted commerce to the horizon. Within the stone embrace of Topkapi, behind gilded gates and latticed screens, another world took shape. An enclosed court where conversation was measured by veils and keys, and where the empire's private life often determined its public future. It was the 16th century under Suleiman the Magnificent, and the harem, misread and sensationalized in foreign dispatches, was becoming, slowly and unmistakably, a political instrument. If you would follow this story to the end, stay with it, subscribe for more measured histories, and join the conversation about the lives that made empires. When a foreign ambassador described the harem in breathless, imagined detail, he wrote as if reporting a curiosity of the exotic. Venetian envoys, English merchants, and Ottoman poets each held their own partial mirror. Taken together, their fragments allow us to see not a bordello of fantasy, but a courtly institution, a school of politics, and a crucible of maternal ambition. The same enclosure that shielded women from the public gaze also concentrated access to the Sultan. The woman who secured that access, by talent, timing, and chance, could bend the currents of succession, build mosques that reshaped the skyline, and set in motion alliances that echoed through decades. The story begins with Harem, known in some sources by the Slavic name she carried before the Topkapi screens, Alexandra, later called Harem Sultan, and by posterity sometimes Roxolana. She arrived in the Sultan's household as many did, uprooted by war and commerce, taken from a Black Sea hinterland where politics had already made women vulnerable to trade and capture. The harem was a state institution, its reach extended beyond personal intimacy. Training, education, and surveillance coexisted inside its walls. For a young woman of foreign origin, intelligence and adaptability were as necessary as beauty. Harem had both, and an early, stubborn capacity to read men. Suleiman had a rare appetite for poetry and law, for campaigns and the slow crafting of imperial memory. He was a man of paradoxes, capable of solicitude and severity in the same breath. In the palace's private apartments, where tiles kept the summer cool and the smell of rosewater threaded the air, Harem evolved from concubine to confidant. This ascent was not a sudden invention of her will alone. It was permitted and shaped by structures that rewarded proximity to the Sultan with influence over patronage, prize, and the future of sons. A handkerchief offered in an audience, a favored seat near the window looking over the Sea of Marmara, small tokens and positions inside those latticed rooms had outsized consequences. Her becoming Suleiman's legal wife was more than a personal triumph, it bent custom. Ottoman sultans had long relied on concubinage rather than marriage to avoid foreign dynastic claims, but Suleiman's decision to elevate harem signaled a recalibration of precedent. That act knotted the private and the public, a legal marriage made visible through architecture, endowments, and the naming of foundations. Harem's patronage, mosques, soup kitchens, charitable complexes, was a language of legitimacy. Buildings on the city's streets advertised presence and permanence where the shadows of the harem rarely reached. Yet Harem's story cannot be read only as a rise. The politics of sons bled into tragedy. Princes were both treasures and threats. The system of succession, rooted in law and hardened by violence, meant every claimant was a possibility and a peril. Earlier Ottoman practice had enshrined fratricide as a brutal rule of statecraft. A victorious prince might order the deaths of brothers to prevent civil war. By the 16th century, that practice began to shift, replaced in practice by confinement and other mechanisms that still produced grievous consequences. The kafes, the cage where princes were kept under supervision, did not nullify danger. It altered it, making psychological damage and intrigue the order of the day instead of immediate bloodshed. In 1553, news raced through the court when Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by an earlier consort, was seized and executed. The event was decisive for Hurrem's arc and for the empire's narrative about the private wielding of power. Mustafa's death, ordered by his father, carried out by the state's executioner, was a rupture that foreign correspondents dressed in conjecture and resentment. Inside Topkapi, the corridors smelled of hot brass and waxed floors. The same stones that heard the Sultan's deliberations also absorbed the whispering shock of mothers who had lost sons and of patrons recalculating their networks. Hurrem's involvement is debated in contemporary accounts and later histories. Yet the larger truth remains. The palace had become a place where maternal strategy and dynastic survival were inseparable, and where decisions taken behind screens could determine who would sit upon the imperial throne. The machinery of the harem was not simply female. Eunuchs, chief among them the black eunuch who oversaw the women's quarters, acted as mediators, gatekeepers, and sometimes kingmakers. Their authority derived from their unique status. Outsiders inside, charged with enforcing rules that kept sexes separated while facilitating the flow of petitions for favors, for appointments, for the fate of a mercantile house or a provincial governor. Castration itself was a grim subject. Islamic law explicitly forbade the practice for Muslims. Yet slave markets and the involvement of non-Muslim intermediaries made the presence of eunuchs a grim fact of imperial administration. Treatment of their condition in later European writings, laced with rumor and scorn, often obscured their political functions. Within the palace, the keys they held were literal and symbolic. They opened chests, doors, and access. Nurbanu's emergence in the late 16th century shows how the pattern continued and transformed. Born Cecilia, according to some Venetian sources, her Venetian family name and murky origins were refracted in the writings of envoys who alternately pitied and vilified her. She became Nurbanu Sultan, consort of Selim II and mother of Murad III. Where Hurrem's ascent had redefined the possibilities of a royal consort, Nurbanu refined them into a model of diplomatic agency. In an age when embassies were both commerce and intelligence, she cultivated foreign contacts and exploited the channels of correspondence. Venetian dispatches, useful but partial, record that Nurbanu received and answered envoys. She placed her fingers upon the levers of trade agreements and pension lists. Her politics were not mere manipulation. They were the operation of a woman who understood that the Ottoman court's rhythms could be read and influenced by those who mastered the arts of patronage and rhetoric. If Hurrem had made architecture her speech, Nurbanu made diplomacy and brokerage hers. She moved within a network of eunuchs, viziers, and merchants, arranging marriages, securing postings, and persuading harried officials to favor her clients. Her role as Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, became institutionalized in new ways. The Valide was no longer only an honorific. She was a player on the imperial board. With that office came the ability to commission buildings, to intercede in legal disputes, and to direct the education and placement of princes. The mosque complexes that rifted the skyline of Istanbul under their patronage were, in effect, the public signatures of rooms inaccessible to most citizens. They proclaimed power in stone and charity. All of this unfolded against a backdrop of law and ritual. Within the harem, girls and young women received instruction. Quranic reading for some, languages for others, embroidery, calligraphy, and the etiquette of court. The hammam, steam and stone, was a place of cleansing and solace, of henna-stained hands and perfumed oils, but it was not merely a place of beauty. It was also an arena for conversation, where alliances were tested and news traveled. The lute's low notes, the rustle of silk, the soft slap of sandals on marble, all these sensory details mattered because they shaped the rhythms of daily life and provided the tacit grammar by which favors were requested and granted. Between Hurrem's tomb and Nurbanu's projects, there is a line of continuity, women who transformed familial devotion into political capital. But continuity does not mean unanimity.
Rivalries crackled like paper. Mothers measured one another's sons as if every cradle were also a future throne. The stakes were not purely personal.
The selection of a successor determined policy, appointments, and the empire's stance toward Europe, Persia, and the Mediterranean. A sultan inclined toward naval power would channel resources differently than a sultan who preferred land campaigns. Thus, maternal choices were national choices. By the early 17th century, Kösem Sultan, born by some accounts as a young Greek woman named Anastasia, would push the logic of maternal politics further. Kösem's life spanned the intimate and the state, favorite, mother, regent. Through marriage and motherhood, she became the linchpin of a shifting system. Her sons, among them Murad IV and Ibrahim, were raised under the shadow of confinement and palace politics. The kafes was, in theory, a humane alternative to fratricide, but in practice it produced men tested by isolation, insecurity, and an education shaped by court faction rather than provincial experience. Kösem navigated these perils. She learned to balance the temper of her sons with the demands of grand viziers and military commanders, to weigh the council of eunuchs against the urgings of ambitious governors. Kösem's regency is a study in the limits and possibilities of female power. When a sultan was young or incapacitated, the valide, or a regent mother, could exercise executive authority. Kösem's regency, practical, bureaucratic, and at times ruthless, exposed the institutional crevices through which a skillful courtier could move. She interfered in appointments, negotiated with commanders, and wielded the patronage lists that kept the provincial machinery functioning. Her contemporaries recorded both admiration and fear. The same hand that arranged a mosque's endowment could also sign the dismissal of a vizier. The line between maternal care and political coercion was thin and often crossed. The reach of these women was tied to a web of intermediaries. The Grand Vizier, officially the Sultan's chief minister, had to negotiate with the palace's informal networks. A vizier's longevity often depended as much on palace favor as on military success. There are recorded instances where a sultan's decision to execute or to exile a subordinate was less the product of a council than of a whispered petition brought by a woman whose son's life or prospects were at risk. Eunuchs, too, conveyed messages and guarded secrets. They could be allies of a valide or of a rival mother. The politics of the court were thus a circulation of favors and fears where fabric tokens and private keys signified authority. For observers outside the imperial walls, the harem became a projection screen for anxieties about gender and power. Western travelers painted lurid portraits, conflating sexual rumor with political reality. Such accounts deserve scrutiny. They reveal as much about European imaginations as they do about Ottoman practice. The reality inside Topkapi, education, brokering, building, the uneasy stewardship of princes, was less a theatrical display of vice than a concentrated mode of governance. To call the harem a political institution is not to romanticize it. It is to recognize that confinement and slavery, patronage and faction, charity and calculation were enmeshed. Women there could be agents, but they were agents within a system that commodified bodies and reduced children to dynastic instruments. Violence, when it entered the palace's history, carried distinct meanings. Execution by bowstring, strangling administered away from public gaze, and the threat of exile were instruments the state used to contain disorder. When Mustafa was killed, or when other princes met similar fates, the act served to forestall civil war, even as it left moral and emotional scars. Contemporary chroniclers recorded these moments with a mixture of resignation and outrage. For mothers, the political calculus could demand cruel choices. To press for a son's prominence risked his life. To withdraw could consign a lineage to obscurity. These were not mere plots in soap operatic fashion. They were decisions that shaped succession laws and international alignments. The architectural footprints of these women provided a counterpoint to palace secrecy.
Hurrem's charitable complexes, Norbanu's commissions, Kesim's endowments, mosques, baths, caravanserais, and tombs were public, permanent statements. They inserted the names of women into the city's topography, making their presence visible to the praying and the passing. To patronize a mosque was to translate private influence into civic legitimacy. It was also a practical way to dispense patronage, to employ craftsmen, and to allocate salaries to the loyal. The buildings were cemeteries of memory and engines of daily life, providing kitchens for the poor and classrooms for boys and girls. In stone, the political projects of the harem found an outward form. Letters and petitions, another medium, served as threads between the inner court and the outer world. Diplomatic correspondence, often mediated through eunuchs or agents, recorded requests for favors or for reassignment of governors. A mother might write to a grand vizier on behalf of a tutor or a provincial bevener on behalf of a merchant. Those letters were less sentimental than strategic. Ambassadors kept copies, sometimes paraphrasing to suit their audiences. Their dispatches are invaluable for historians, but they must be read with care. Each envoy brought a cultural lens that could turn routine patronage into scandal and negotiation into seduction. Close scenes, reconstructed with attention to plausibility rather than as certainties, help us imagine the textures of daily life. In a private sala, the light slanted through a screen long enough to reveal snippets of the courtyard beyond.
Harem, seated upon cushions stitched with gold thread, adjusted a small book of poems while a eunuch fetched water cooled in cedar. She inclined her head as Suleiman entered, the scent of his cloak trailing saffron and sweat from campaign. Their exchanges, when they took place behind curtains, were intimate not merely because of feeling, but because each word could be a grant or a withdrawal. In another chamber, years later, Norbanu read a dispatch from Venice and considered how to channel a trading house's plea into a naval appointment for an ally. Her fingers hovered over an inventory list. To reward a friend was to cement a network that might protect her son. Kosem, older and seasoned, understood how the faintest administrative signature could alter a province's loyalty. She learned to keep lists, to weigh petitions, and to read the temper of provincial governors who were more at ease with cavalry than with harem politics. When a vizier misstepped, when a janissary regiment grumbled, when the coffers ran low, it was often a mother in a closed room who triaged the crisis. Her decisions could stabilize the state or inflame it. The human cost of the system must not be elided. Slavery was an engine of social reproduction within the empire. Children and young women were moved as commodities. Their labor and bodies made the palaces possible. The legal frameworks around slavery and castration were complex and laden with contradiction. Islamic law proscribed castrating a Muslim, yet the demand for eunuchs produced ugly compromises. Chroniclers recorded the sorrow of families and the silences of women whose agency was circumscribed by the color of their skin or the accident of capture. Women like Harem and Kosem rose from that condition. Their stories demonstrate both the possibilities and the injustice of a system that made political assent contingent on a prior dispossession. The latter decades of this narrative show how the Sultanate of Women became paradoxically institutionalized. The Valid Sultan's office consolidated precedents, formal audiences, public endowments, the power to intercede in policy, and the skillful play of influence through patronage. The phenomenon reached its apogee when women in the imperial family systematically exercised regency and counsel in ways previously ad hoc. Rather than being anomalies, Harem, Norbanu, and Kosem became exemplars of a new normal in which maternal networks mattered as much as military victories for the shape of the state. But these gains carried fragility. Power concentrated in an enclosed household attracted rivals. Factions of viziers, military leaders, and provincial notables resisted female authority when it afforded advantage.
Assassinations and depositions, performed with administrative precision and cloaked in legalese, returned again and again.
Kösem's own end, in the mid-17th century, was violent and symbolic. The palace that had been her instrument of rule became the scene of her removal. It was a reminder that the agency of women in the Ottoman court, however real, always navigated a precarious balance between patronage and peril. Historians and readers should resist the temptation to reduce these women to archetypes. They were patrons and strategists, mothers and builders, sometimes tender, sometimes unforgiving, always entangled in an imperial logic that made private devotion a public calculation. Their influence reshaped succession practices, drew new lines on the urban map, and reoriented diplomatic channels. To understand the Ottoman Empire in the early modern world is to understand how the interior of Topkapi was itself an instrument of statecraft. By the time Suleiman's successors took the throne, the imprint of female power had been set into the empire's institutions. Mosques and charitable complexes offered tangible proof. Diplomatic letters and edicts recorded the subtler channels of influence. The Sultanate of Women was not merely a moment of individual brilliance, but a transformation of political culture that acknowledged how maternal and domestic networks could be harnessed or feared as centers of authority. If there is irony in this history, it is the way public visibility and private confinement were braided together. The women who achieved sway did so through acts both intimate and administrative. A lullaby to a prince, a signed endowment, a whispered recommendation to a vizier. In the end, their stories force a reimagining of power in early modern empires. Power was not only exercised in the field or in the divan of state. It flowed through chambers shadowed by screens, through lists of salaries, through the soft weight of a handkerchief placed upon a sultan's arm. The misreadings of the past, exoticizing the harem, reducing it to salacious fantasy, have obscured a core historical fact. The Ottoman court's private spaces were also sites of political experimentation. They formed a parallel track where mothers could cultivate loyalties, where eunuchs could broker access, and where patronage could become policy. That insight reorients how historians must look at decisions that shaped foreign relations, taxation, and imperial administration. Across 3 generations, Hürrem's architectural language, Nurbanu's diplomatic brokerage, Kösem's regential administration, the equation shifted. Female actors did not merely react to power, they invented forms for wielding it. The legacy of their interventions persisted long after their deaths. The stones they set into the city, the endowments that funded schools, the patterns of patronage that subsequent valids would emulate. Yet the story remains ambivalent, an interplay of agency and constraint, of beneficence and brutality. In the next sequence, we will follow a decisive episode at the heart of these transformations, a campaign that tested a sultan's judgment, a letter from Venice that threatened a fragile alliance, and the moment a mother decided whether to intervene on behalf of a son. The choices made in those rooms would shape not only a family, but the empire's direction. The campaign was ready to move before the spring thaw. Banners were being mended in the barracks. The engineers packed their carpentry, and the sappers their barrels of pitch. Dispatches went and returned along the same routes that carried pilgrims and merchants, from the capital to the frontier, from the frontier to the divan. A sultan's judgment, however, is never only forged by maps and muster rolls. It was in the quieted intervals, the lamplit corridors of Topkapi, the measured counsel of the Grand Vizier, the trembling report of a captain, that the real test of leadership was often decided. In one such interval, a letter arrived that would unmake the certainty of a march. The missive came from the Venetian bailo. It was the kind of paper that men at the outer gate knew by touch. Heavy rag, folded, sealed with a wax impressed by a device that marked the weight of a republic's interest. The bailo had long been a familiar figure within the city's diplomacy, not merely a merchant agent, but a broker between dock and divan.
His letters had once been read and set aside like accounts of spices and bolts of cloth. Now they carried the geometry of alliances. The letter itself was plain in form and sharpened in intent. Venice, the Bailo said, observed with anxiety the movement of troops and the tenor of councils. The Republic's fleets worried at Habsburg ports. Her merchants trembled at the thought of a prolonged opening of hostilities that would choke trade. If the Sultan pressed his army into a costly campaign without regard to the balance of mercantile interests, Venice would be forced to a political accommodation elsewhere. To secure her grain and her markets, she might look to other partners, or, worse for the port, to a tacit neutrality that would leave Ottoman fleets exposed at sea. The Bailo offered a narrow path: restraint coupled with negotiated concessions. He promised, in guarded phrase, that Venetian influence could be marshaled to blunt an alliance adverse to the port, provided the port signaled willingness to bargain on matters of duty and caravan rights. Such a letter ought to have been passed to the Grand Vizier and filed with the customary caution. Instead, it made its slow way toward one of the palace's most unexpected stages of politics, the inner chamber of the Valide. Nurbanu read the lines by a narrow window, the city's light paling over her hands. The scent of rosewater and beeswax lingered in the room. The lamp threw her profile into relief against the carved screens. She was no stranger to the language of gifts and veiled threats.
Her life had been a suturing of private tenderness to public calculation, a prayer offered in the dawn and a petition pressed between two fingers at noon. Tonight she held Venice's voice as if it were a fabric whose weave she must inspect for holes. The question she faced was not merely of statecraft, but of consequence. War would expend men and money. It would empty the coffers that paid stipends to the teachers of her foundations, to the servants of her walks, and to the artisans whose carved stone gave her patronage a public face. A protracted armed enterprise could also strain the loyalties she had cultivated among the military households and the provincial notables who depended on the regular flow of salaries. Yet to counsel forbearance might be read as weakness by the men who measure honor in banners and trumpet calls. Mothers in the palace had learned to balance these metrics: the life of a son, the life of an empire, the life of a city, all pressed against one another. She did not rush to spectacle. Nurbanu summoned the chief eunuch and two of her oldest clerks, men who had kept the records of her endowments, who knew which stipends were due and where arrears would kindle discontent. She asked them for accounts in the coldest of voices, not to parade for the Sultan, but to understand the arithmetic of patience. They turned over ledgers, muttered about the grain prices in Galata, weighed the coinage arriving from Egypt, spoke of the small loans that kept caravans on their routes. The numbers did not flatter boldness. If the campaign continued without pause, the palace's ordinary payments would be delayed. The instructors in the school she had founded would go unpaid. Rumblings of discontent in the provinces would grow. Still, arithmetic is only one courtly instrument. The Valide also knew the language of men who measure power in gestures and intimacies. She called for a quietly worded conference with the vizier the Sultan most trusted. In their private talk she did not scold. She framed a counsel as a mother frames a plea. She reminded the vizier of the city's mortar and the murmur among merchants, of the weight that a single neutral or allied port could carry when a winter's famine came. She suggested a pause calibrated to preserve honor, a message of firm intent sent to the frontier, accompanied by a diplomatic opening through consuls and envoys designed to buy time and to test the sincerity of Venice's assurance. The vizier left with a careful face. He carried the Valide's words the way a field commander carries a plan that has been altered in an instant. A note was prepared, not a capitulation, but an adjustment. It spoke of the Sultan's resolve to defend imperial claims, and of a willingness, in the interim, to examine matters of duty and commerce. It asked only that Venice show proofs of good faith. The note went back by the same channels that had brought the Bailo's warning. Within the palace, the choice rippled. Some high officials,
Men whose fortunes were tied to immediate glory interpreted the delay as cowardice. They began to murmur against the Walids' influence, to say that palace machinations had edged out the sober counsel of the divan. Others, whose pockets were lined with the returns of trade, breathed relief. The pious saw in restraint room for mercy and provision. The army's captains grumbled, as soldiers do where promise of plunder is a spur. Yet the Sultan, who attended to his mother's counsel with an intimacy the court understood and feared, held back the trumpets. He ordered engineers to reinforce frontier works, but withheld the great stride that would send battalions clanging into the field. For a time, the gamble held. Venice responded with a measured reply. Not the full embrace the Bilo's paper had hinted at, but a willingness to delay overt support for the Habsburgs while further negotiations took place. Merchants in Galata breathed easier. The city's guilds found their ledgers less prone to sudden collapse. Nurbanu's endowments continued to pay teachers and janitors. Her masjid continued to feed the poor on its appointed days. The palace hummed with the discreet confidence of a household that had been spared an immediate drain. But the pause also invited calculation elsewhere. Factions that saw advantage in haste recommitted themselves to designs of intrigue. The Habsburgs, denied decisive Venetian aid, turned toward other quarters, seeking alliances that would not be so easily soothed by delay. The frontier commanders, forced to endure the cold and the waiting, pressed for a decision that would vindicate their reputations. And for the mother who had made the choice, the satisfaction was threaded with doubt. Had she preserved her son by postponing a test, or had she seeded a longer contest that would demand more blood and more resource in the years to come? In the weeks that followed, the palace became a theater of smaller, consequential acts. Messages were exchanged through eunuchs and through the ritualized opening of petitions. Waqf documents were examined to ensure that charity might be sustained through the leaner months. The Bilo sent further assurances, and with them, the subtle reminder that the Republic's favors were not permanent. Nurbanu took up the older craft by which Walids had long governed. She built hedges as much as bridges. She staked out enough influence to temper a sultan's impulse, and enough generosity to keep the engines of the city turning. Her choice was both vindicated and complicated by what followed. The immediate crisis dissolved into a season of bargaining rather than a single catastrophe. Yet the interval allowed other tensions to ferment in other quarters of the empire, where the calculus of war and peace did not pause for the architecture of patronage. The lesson was ancient and freshly lived. The exercise of power inside Topkapi could postpone a clash, but could not entirely forestall the structural pressures that made collision likely. It was in these small postponements, the signed waqf, the whispered counsel, the withheld order, that female authority revealed both its potency and its limits. And so the campaign proper, when it did come, was not the same as it would have been if the Sultan had marched at once. The frontier met an army seasoned by delay, supplies realigned, and diplomacy rearranged the map of possible enemies. The cost had been altered, fewer immediate casualties perhaps, but a longer war in the making, whose burdens would be borne by the provinces and whose justice would be debated in the divan for years. The mother who had intervened carried forward from that moment a reputation not of sovereign command, but of careful stewardship. Her decisions would be cited by allies and impugned by rivals. They would acquire the kind of ambiguous legacy that marks much of the sultanate of women, prudent in the short term, perilous in the long. Beyond the palace, the stone and mortar of the city kept their mute record. Schools she had endowed continued to teach boys who would later become scribes. A fountain she had repaired kept on pouring. A caravanserai on the road to the west remained a claim on commerce. In the private rooms where a mother's hand still soothed fevered brows, the same gestures that had once simply saved an heir's life now folded into the craft of state. The letter from Venice had been a single thread. Nurbanu's decision wove it into a larger cloth, a cloth of patronage, of prudence, and of power that could defer but not always deflect the march of empires. The episode remained instructive for those who watched the palace as a court of state. It showed how the Sultan's judgment could be bent not only by the sword or by the divan's rhetoric, but by a mother's knowledge of markets and mosques, by her capacity to translate the private needs of household into the public arithmetic of survival. It also showed the fragile arithmetic of such influence. Every saved stipend, every granted reprieve made enemies elsewhere, and required, in time, a response of equal craft. The siyasat within the harem had thus become a permanent instrument in the governance of the realm, and an instrument whose tuning required constant attention. Down the line, the choice rippled in ways both visible and subtle. Merchants would tell the tale in Galata cafes. Ambitious viziers would cite it when they sought to embarrass the palace. Poets would turn it into an image of a handkerchief held over a sultan's brow. Yet the true measure was quieter, the patience of a city that did not starve in a winter of uncertainty, the continued functioning of schools and baths, the avoidance, for a season, of a rout whose echoes could have undone more than a battlefield could repair. In those quiet reckonings, the Sultanate of Women found one of its enduring rationales, not the ostentation of power, but the daily labor of holding the polity together by means that were at once gentle and decisive. The path that opened from that night's decision was neither straight nor safe. It branched into negotiations and into rivalries. It fed into the old cycles of patronage that could make allies out of servants and enemies out of brothers. As men read the ledger and the muster roll anew, as the bailo filed another report, and the Grand Vizier sharpened his speech for the divan, the palace continued to be the locus where private motives met public consequence. The Mother's Council had steered the ship for a while, yet the sea was wide and restless, and other storms would soon be upon it. In the days that followed, the palace took on the slow rhythm of recuperation and calculation. The courtyards filled again with the measured footsteps of pages and the clatter of dishes. The aroma of stewed lamb and simmered legumes drifted under eaves where whispers now traveled as surely as the pigeons that nested on the roof. Nurbanu moved among these familiar noises like a woman whose hands remembered the cartography of influence. She walked past the madrasa she had endowed, pausing at a window to watch boys bend over their copying slate. She lingered at a fountain, feeling the cool spray on her palms and thinking, not of vanity, but of the ledger that balanced a city's patience against an army's appetite. Outside the palace walls, decisions already began to take the shape of partisan histories. Men who had lost in the careful game of reprieves claimed victory. Men who had profited from the pause bitterly confessed defeat. A former ally of the late Sultan, a provincial bey who had seen his opportunity to plunder postponed by orders from Topkapi, gathered his followers and told them that the court had grown soft, that mercy produced weakness in the provinces. He sent riders with secret letters, their seals disguised, promising coin and titles to those who would press the frontier while the capital debated. In Aleppo and Konya, the rumor of delayed pay moved like a fever. Artisans delayed their shipments, caravan masters tightened their belts, and small merchants in the bazaars accepted shorter credit with a resigned murmur. The Grand Vizier, whose own standing had been measured by his reaction to the Mother's Council, took a different tack in public and private. Before the divan, he spoke with the authority of a man who would not be considered indecisive. He praised the providence of the palace. He spoke of the necessity of measure. He reminded judges and sanjakbeys that the stability of the realm could not be wagered on the glory of a single victory. In private, however, his words were sharper. He summoned captains and tax farmers in the shadowed rooms behind the divan to review muster rolls, to examine the readiness of the artillery houses, to rearrange the routes by which food and fodder might reach the frontier. He wrote long letters that folded like maps, the edges annotated with names and sums. He sent them by trustworthy hands to Anatolia and Rumelia, and under his signature he added a margin, "Do not presume the station of the palace." It was a signal intended both for allies and for rivals.
a gentle reminder that the machinery of state would not be wholly surrendered to the gentleness of a mother's will. Within the harem, the currents of influence wound themselves anew. There were women who believed, with a kind of fierce gratitude, that the pause had preserved a life and thereby guarded the dynasty. They tended the children and taught them letters, and they pushed for alliances within the household that turned on generosity and mutual obligation. Others, however, watched the same events with the practiced eye of calculation. For them, the saved stipend was a debt to be called in. They whispered of reputations to be undermined and of patrons to be courted. A favorite of the Sultan, a woman whose own fortunes had been made by the distribution of bread and small favors to the palace servants, began, with the discreet help of a eunuch, to gather names of those who had profited under Nurbanu's patronage, and to place them where political pressure would be felt most, in the neighborhoods where the maliche and the cutlery makers met, in the small mosques where petty grievances became petitions that rose, with time, to the ears of men who counted votes in different ledgers. Meanwhile, the Republic's Bilo sent his own dispatches. He reported not only on the Sultan's reprieve, but on the new alignments of trade, on the shifting loyalties among the Greek archons of the islands, on the strange affection that some Venetian merchants felt for the court's stability, for their profits, after all, prospered when caravans moved and when docks remained busy. The Bilo's letters were perfumed with a diplomat's mixture of respect and caution. He praised the mother's sagacity where it served Venetian interest. He protested where it inconveniently propped the enemy. He promised, in sentences that suggested both flattery and calculation, the stability of supply if the court would continue to keep the land roads open. The Venetian knotted his words like thread in a carpet. Every compliment contained a request. Every request a threat folded small. Away from the capital, the war that had been postponed did not sleep. Border bands raided for sustenance. A commander in Rumelia, bitter that his expedition had been stalled by the palace's hand, diverted his attention to local raids and thereby created a new pattern of insecurity that would, in time, require more troops to repair than the Sultan's swift sword would have needed. Meanwhile, the Republic's Bilo sent his own dispatches. He reported not only on the Sultan's reprieve, but on the new alignments of trade, on the shifting loyalties among the Greek archons of the islands, on the strange affection that some Venetian merchants felt for the court's stability, for their profits, after all, prospered when caravans moved and when docks remained busy. The Bilo's letters were perfumed with a diplomat's mixture of respect and caution. He praised the mother's sagacity where it served Venetian interest. He protested where it inconveniently propped the enemy. He promised, in sentences that suggested both flattery and calculation, the stability of supply if the court would continue to keep the land roads open. The Venetian knotted his words like thread in a carpet. Every compliment contained a request. Every request a threat folded small. Away from the capital, the war that had been postponed did not sleep. Border bands raided for sustenance. A commander in Rumelia, bitter that his expedition had been stalled by the palace's hand, diverted his attention to local raids, and thereby created a new pattern of insecurity that would, in time, require more troops to repair than the Sultan's swift sword would have needed.
In the towns along the Danube, fortifications were repaired not because the palace had wished them so, but because merchants, growing nervous about the delay, themselves paid masons and carpenters to rebuild gates. A cautious sort of resilience emerged, not born of the central court's wisdom, but of necessity. In that resilience lay both promise and peril. The provinces would come to depend on their own repairs, and in doing so would foster the habits of power that could, when time and debt accrued, resent Topkapi's interventions. In the literary circles of the city, poets found verse in the faint drama. One of them, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a reputation for sharp observation, spun an image that spread through coffee houses like the scent of spice. A handkerchief on a brow, he wrote, could cool fever and so postpone death, but it could not save a man who had burned his bridges. His couplets were quoted in jest and in grief. Merchants quoted them over coffee, and soldiers repeated them in the alehouses at the harbor. The couplet became a mirror in which the capital could see itself, generous, careful, but always aware of the cost borne by those who lived at a distance from the palace's comforts. Nurbanu, for her part, continued to move with the measured confidence she had cultivated. She received envoys with a practiced kindness, distilling disputes into gifts or into small acts of administration that bound supplicants to her. When a letter arrived from a village beyond the Black Sea accusing a governor of heavy levies, she wrote back in a hand that betrayed neither favoritism nor dismissal. She ordered an inquiry that did not humiliate the governor publicly, but sent inspectors who, with the quiet authority of the palace, rebalanced collections and quietly returned certain monies. Such actions created, as she knew they would, a network of allegiance. A widow who received a pittance back from her son's confiscated tools. An imam whose mosque was finally relieved of an unfair tithe. A merchant who found his contract restored. Each such small restitution was a grain in the scales, and the scales mattered. And yet there were consequences that could not be elegantly arranged. A noble of the Anatolian countryside, long accustomed to the Sultan's forests being open for his hunts and his men's pastures, found himself affronted by the new austerity. He had expected, as custom allowed, that a pause would be turned to a private advantage. When that expectation failed, he turned his frustration into a covert alliance with a vizier who saw in the noble a useful instrument. The two conspired to embarrass the palace's choice through a sequence of small provocations designed to appear like accident. A misrouted convoy here, a delayed levy there. A rumor of corruption whispered where it would find the ears of merchants and the pens of discontented scribes.
The palace learned, slowly, that mercy could be read as weakness by those who counted only immediate gain. The greatest peril, perhaps, was not the combination of resentment and conspiracy, but the shifting mathematics of external power. The enemy on the frontier had, in the months of delay, recalibrated its own plans. It fortified a river crossing that had once been thought lightly held. It negotiated with a Cretan islander who would, for coin, close a small channel that had been convenient for Ottoman supply boats. In the east, a rival magnate, jealous of the Sultan's earlier conquests, moved tribes across a plain and thereby unsettled grain flows. Each adjustment did not end the possibility of success for the Sultan's campaigns, but it increased the price and multiplied the contingencies. The Mother's Council had bought time. That time, like a coin, could be spent on strengthening or on paying off new and unforeseen debts. This multiplicity of effect was most visible in the quiet conversations that took place after nightfall. In a small chamber where the lamps burned low, Nurbanu summoned two men she trusted, a veteran eunuch who had once carried dispatches across the straits, and a former sea captain turned courtier who kept accounts of shipping in meticulous ledger rows. The eunuch spoke first of loyalty, of how hearts within the palace had bent toward her counsel, because they had seen a life spared, and of how, therefore, the palace could not now appear arbitrary. The captain, however, produced a map folded into thirds, inked along routes where caravans had slowed. He pointed with a steady finger to nodes where the empire's supply touched its weakness. A single bridge whose destruction would starve a field army in less than a month. A caravanserai where a bandit lord had begun to demand tolls. "We have bought a season," he said softly, "but seasons demand feeding. You must choose where to plant, mother." His words were without flattery. Nurbanu listened, thinking of the madrasa, the fountain, the caravanserai by the western road she had once repaired from her own purse. She thought, too, of the child whose fever had begun the long discussion of justice and prudence. She thought of the Sultan, of his temper and his tendency to valor. In her mind, the arithmetic reconfigured itself.
An act of mercy, she felt, was still an act of governance, and governance required not heroic moments, but attentive footwork. "Then let us plant where the people will feel it," she answered at last. "Let our charity be not merely an act of sentiment, but an instrument of steadiness. Repair that bridge, pay those masons, restore the market tolls temporarily, but do it in a way that binds those who receive to the palace, not to the promises of men who trade on chaos." They set, as a result, a small program of repairs and stipends that would, they hoped, be large enough to check immediate discontent and small enough to avoid bankrupting the treasury.
Money moved in narrow channels from the palace's reserve. Inspectors were dispatched with clear orders to leave no trace of partisan favoritism. Contracts were drawn privately to keep envy from igniting public suspicion. The Grand Vizier approved with the guarded enthusiasm of a man who understood both the necessity of action and the danger of appearing beholden. In the bazaars, carpenters and masons found employment. In the caravans, drivers tasted the comfort of coin. For a while, the city breathed more easily. But subtle consequences continued to redraft alliances. The noble who had felt slighted grew more embittered. The vizier who had plotted privately recognized that the palace, by distributing small mercy and visible repairs, had mollified many of the population the vizier had hoped to enlist. He therefore widened his ambitions elsewhere, turning to factions within the military and to a network of provincial judges who owed him favors. A new game began to take shape, one that no longer centered solely on the moral equation of mercy versus might, but around the more modern arithmetic of credit, obligation, and reputation. The Mother's Act had become an opening gambit in a longer contest over the very mechanisms by which the state sustained itself. Late into the autumn, an envoy arrived from a distant Sanjak with a report that showed both the fruit and the seed of the palace's maneuvers. He came in the manner of provincial messengers, dusty, with a robe reeking of travel, and bearing an account of a skirmish that had taken place while the court argued. The skirmish turned out to be indecisive. The border lords exchanged raiding bands, and no great loss was counted on either side. Yet the Sanjak's men had, in the absence of immediate imperial command, declared their own truce for a fortnight to gather grain for the winter. Such local truces were small mercies born of necessity, and the messenger, with a mixture of pride and unease, reported that the local people were grateful. "They say," he told the eunuch and the captain who had taken him in, "that the palace's pause gave them room to set their houses in order. They bless the Sultan's mother for that which she granted. Yet they ask, will the palace remember them when the armies return?" His question lingered like smoke beneath the lamps. It was a practical question and a moral one, and it was the sort of question that would shape the next cycle of decisions. The palace had bought a season of calm, redistributed obligations in ways that preserved the city's functioning, and altered the war's landscape. But the world beyond the fountain and the madrasas took its own measures, and so the chessboard shifted. Allies moved to new squares, enemies staked new claims, and the instruments of governance, wafts, stipends, contracts, and the whisperings at the divan became both shields and arrows. Nurbanu, who had been schooled in the art of patient intervention, felt the strain of that lesson in the evening when she stood in the upper gallery and looked across the Bosphorus. Ships passed like slow thoughts. Lamps winked along the shorelines, and the city, which had been steadied by a handkerchief placed on a fevered brow, waited to see whether such steadiness would suffice against the deeper arithmetic of politics. She did not know, and no one in the palace pretended to know, whether the kind of governance she favored would in the end outlast the appetites of men who would use delay to their advantage. What she knew was the immediacy of the people whose lives had been preserved and the complicity of the state in that preservation. She had altered the course of one night, and, by doing so, had altered the course of many nights to come. The consequences would unfold, in the divan's speeches, in the bazaar's murmurs, in the frontier's small fires. And when they did, the palace would once more be forced to choose between the expedient and the enduring. For now, though, she turned from the window, and the lamps burned low as the city settled into its uneasy, deliberate sleep.